Before the age of 50, the Spanish-born artist, Pablo Picasso became the most well-known painter in the world. During his career he created thousands of paintings, prints, engravings, and illustrations, as well as sculptures, ceramics, theatre sets and costumes. On the negative side, Picasso had a history of physically and mentally abusing his wives, his lovers, and his muses alike. He was serially promiscuous all his adult life. He viewed women as sexual objects who were there to meet his needs. He wooed them, adored them, and abused them. And, when he tired of them, he discarded them and moved on. Picasso's view on women was simple: there are only two kinds of women, he said: goddesses and doormats. Picasso was born in Malaga, in southern Spain, in 1881. He was the first child of Don José Ruiz and Maria Picasso. Picasso's birth name was Pablo Ruiz. In fact, it was a great deal longer than that, but we will stick to the shorter version here. Picasso's family had a middle-class background. His father, José Ruiz, specialized in naturalistic drawings of birds and animals. For most of his life, he was a professor of art at various schools, and a curator of a local museum. At the age of 7, Picasso began formal art training with the help of his father. He copied masterworks, and practiced drawing from live figure models and plaster casts. The young Picasso loved art, but his other schoolwork suffered. In 1891, when Picasso was 10 years old, the family moved to northern Spain, where his father became a professor at the local School of Fine Arts. They spent 4 years there. Picasso's father claimed his son surpassed him as an artist at the age of 13. He felt humbled by his son's natural skill and ability and vowed that he would stop painting, rather than compete with him. The family moved to Barcelona, where Picasso's father took a position at the School of Fine Arts. His father persuaded the officials at the academy to allow his son to take an entrance exam for the advanced class. This process often took students a month, but Picasso completed it in a week, and the jury admitted him, at just 13 years of age. As a student, Picasso lacked discipline, but made many friends. His father rented a small studio for him, close to home, so that the boy could work alone. But he checked up on him several times a day to critique his drawings. At the time, the young Picasso painted subjects realistically and employed a true-to-life color palette. He particularly enjoyed painting portraits of his family members, and scenes inspired by his Catholic faith. Traditional academic realism appears in his works of the mid-1890s, as is shown in this painting, The First Communion, a large composition showing his sister, Lola, at the altar. At the age of 16, Picasso painted Science and Charity, which won a gold medal at the Fine Arts exhibition in Malaga. Picasso's father was the model for the doctor at the table. In October 1897, Picasso set off for the first time on his own to begin his studies at the San Fernando Academy of Fine Arts in Madrid, the country's foremost art school. He hated the formal instruction, which was repeating what he already knew, so he stopped attending classes soon after he enrolled. Madrid held many other attractions for him. The Prado Museum housed paintings by Velázquez, Goya, and El Greco. Picasso especially admired the works of El Greco, and elements such as elongated limbs, arresting colors, and mystical views soon appeared in his work. Picasso copied several of Goya's works, including this portrait of the bullfighter Pepe Ilo. From 1899, Picasso's paintings took on a less lifelike quality, what some call his modernist period. Undoubtedly influenced by expressionists and post-impressionists, the strong colors and melting forms of this picture confirm Picasso's growing interest in experimenting with freeform styles at the time. In the spring of 1898, Picasso caught scarlet fever. He moved to a small town south of Barcelona, where he stayed for a year to recover. He painted this work at the time. On his return to Barcelona, he was a changed man. He had put on weight, he had learned to live on his own in the open countryside, he spoke Catalan, and, most importantly, he had made the decision to break with his art school training, and to reject his family's plans for his future. He even began to show a preference for his mother's Italian surname, and more often than not, he signed his works Pr Picasso, instead of Pablo Ruiz. By late 1901 he had dropped the Ruiz altogether. In 1899, now in Barcelona, Picasso frequented a tavern called the Four Cats. Here he mixed with Catalan artists and writers of the Barcelona modernist art movement, who all believed their artistic futures lay in Paris. Picasso had his first art exhibition at the Four Cats in February 1900, and his friends at the restaurant were the subjects of more than 50 of his portraits and paintings in the show. In October of the same year, 19-year-old Picasso made his first trip to Paris with his friend and studio companion, Carlos Casagemas. The pair visited the 1900 Universal Exhibition in Paris, where one of Picasso's works, Last Moments, was being shown. The painting, a dark, moody modernista piece, had been selected to hang in the Spanish section in the Grand Palais. Later, Last Moments was painted over, but an X-ray study of the modified canvas shows a priest at the bedside of a dying woman. This pious theme contrasts with Picasso's growing interest in the bars, brothels and the street life of Paris that would soon influence his paintings. One of Picasso's principal artistic discoveries on his trip to Paris was color. Not the drab, earthy colors of the Spanish palette, but brilliant color, the colors of France, of new fashion, of a city celebrating a world fair. Using charcoal, pastels, watercolors, and oils, Picasso began recording life in the French capital. His first Paris painting, Le Moulin de la Galette, reflect his fascination with the lusty decadence and gaudy glamour of the famous dance halls, where rich patrons and willing prostitutes met for an evening of fun. After just 2 months, Picasso returned to Spain with his friend, who had become depressed about a failed love affair. After having tried unsuccessfully to rouse Casagemas from his gloom, Picasso left by himself and traveled back to Madrid. In February 1901, Casagemas returned to Paris, attempted to shoot the woman he loved, and then turned the gun on himself and was killed. Picasso was deeply affected. He had lost his loyal friend, and perhaps also felt a sense of guilt for having abandoned him. Several months later, Picasso made a death study of his friend. 2 years later, he took up the subject of his friend's death again, in the enigmatic painting, La Vie, now in the Cleveland Museum of Art. La Vie is potentially the most complex work of what is called Picasso's Blue Period. The various elements of the painting remain mysterious and open to interpretation. In October 1902, Picasso moved back to Paris, where he met journalist and poet Max Jacob. Jacob helped Picasso to learn French. Soon, the friends, who were both penniless, shared a room together. As they had only one bed, Max slept at night, while Picasso slept during the day and worked at night. These were times of severe poverty, cold, and desperation. Much of Picasso's working materials were burned in the fireplace to keep the small room warm. During the period 1901 to 1904, now known as his Blue Period, a depressed Picasso moved back and forth between Barcelona and Paris, taking material for his work from one place to the other. He spent much of his time in Barcelona, and it was there that he produced the most important of his Blue Period paintings. In these works, Picasso created a pictorial world entirely in shades of blue and green, only occasionally warmed by other colors. It was a sad and hopeless world, of those on the fringes of society. These people could be seen in the streets and bars of any big city: beggars, the blind and lonely, and impoverished women. Picasso used these themes to create somber reflections on life that mirrored his own feelings. An oppressive mood of sadness pervades these works. Motionless, the figures in the paintings remain pensive, isolated and lonely. The dominant blue tones give an unreal character to the images, creating a world that seems beyond time and place. Certain figures reoccur, such as the lonely woman, the mother, and the couple in a close embrace. These are not momentary observations, for unlike the quick sketches of his earlier works, Picasso developed the paintings of the Blue period slowly and carefully. He made many sketches and variations, and regularly painted over already completed works. The same sorrowful mood pervades the well-known etching The Frugal Meal, which shows a blind man and a sighted woman, both emaciated, and seated at a nearly bare table. When he first exhibited these paintings, reviewers praised their expressive symbolism, but criticized their unrelieved note of depression. The pictures of the Blue period are among Picasso's most enigmatic works. In 1903, Picasso moved to Paris permanently, and lived for a time at the Bateau Lavoir. This old piano factory in Montmartre turned out to be the scene of one of the most unlikely gatherings in modern art. The Bateau Lavoir, named by Max Jacob for its resemblance to the laundry boats that worked the Seine, was the home at the same time of Pablo Picasso, Juan Gris, Kees van Dongen and Amedeo Modigliani. Originally converted into studios in 1889, whatever glory it had once had was long gone. The Bateau Lavoir was a difficult place to live. There was no running water, and cockroaches were everywhere. It was an icebox in winter, and a steam bath in the summer. All the tenants had to share one toilet on the ground floor. But it had one big advantage: it was extremely cheap. Rent was only 15 francs a month, compared to 1 franc a night at the local hotel. The low rent allowed Picasso to pursue experimental avenues in his work. In the autumn of 1904, Picasso met Fernand Olivier, an artist's model working at the Bateau Lavoir. From 1904 to 1907, Fernand became Pablo's lover, model, and domestic companion. Theirs was an unsettled relationship. Picasso was possessive, jealous, self-absorbed, and neglectful of his personal hygiene. And, despite Picasso wanting her to be a kept woman in their studio apartment, Fernand insisted on being independent in her professional and private relationships, as well as in her sexual encounters. Despite their differences, Picasso began to feel more positive about his prospects, and Fernand appeared in his latest paintings, many of which are influenced by his relationship with her. The generally upbeat and optimistic mood of his works in this period is reminiscent of his paintings prior to his Blue period. However, their relationship was characterized by its tempestuousness. Both Fernand and Picasso were jealous lovers, and their passion sometimes exploded into violence. By 1905, Picasso had largely overcome his feelings of gloom. Not only was he madly in love with his beautiful Fernand, he at last had a little money, thanks to his new art dealer who arranged one-man shows for him. For entertainment, he and Fernand often visited the nearby Medrano Circus in Montmartre. There, among the sideshows of the fair, Picasso made friends with the harlequins, jugglers and strolling players that lived there. His artistic focus began to shift from individuals living in despair to his friends, the circus performers, whom he used as models. Between 1904 and 1906, in what is now known as Picasso's Rose period, he continued his characteristically painterly style. Blue tones are still present in these paintings, but they are contrasted by warmer shades. Picasso's entertainers still have a subdued melancholy, but it is no longer the unrelieved despair of the Blue Period works. Oppressive loneliness has given way to family life, and the clowns and acrobats, for all their vulnerability and helplessness, radiate an inner closeness in his works. With tender gestures and touches, they turn to and protect each other. The traveling circus and its artists became painting subjects that Picasso shared with a new and important friend, the French poet Guillaume Apollinaire. To both the poet and the painter, the wandering performers became a kind of statement of the artist's position in society. In his painting Family of Acrobats, Picasso reinforces this view by showing himself in the role of Harlequin, while his friend Apollinaire is the strongman. From then on, the Harlequin became Picasso's personal symbol. In 1905, Picasso was sharing his studio with several Dutch artists. One invited Picasso to holiday with him in his home in North Holland for a few weeks. Picasso took the opportunity to get away from Paris for a while to explore the Dutch countryside. While he was there, he painted several landscapes, and this portrait La Belle Hollandaise, which is now displayed in the Queensland, Australia, Art Gallery. The model is unknown, but many young Dutch women in the north of the country worked on dairy farms, and continued to wear the traditional costumes and dress of the region, including the white bonnet worn by the model in the painting. Around 1905, wealthy American brother and sister art collectors, Leo and Gertrude Stein, became Picasso's principal patrons. They acquired his drawings and paintings, and exhibited them in their informal salons at their home in Paris. The couple also appeared in Picasso's work. Gertrude is pictured here in his portrait of Gertrude Stein, one of his most famous works. Picasso has reduced her body to simple masses, foreshadowing his later Cubist works. Her face is shown here as a mask, with heavy-lidded eyes, probably reflecting his recent encounter with Iberian sculpture. Picasso painted Harlequin with glass in 1905. Here, he has left behind the joyless world of the Blue Period, and is now experimenting with the stronger colors that appear in this work. The painting shows the owner of the cabaret as the guitar player. Also, the woman Picasso's friend Casagemas tried to kill, and Picasso himself as the Harlequin. Picasso gave this painting to the cabaret owner to pay off his bar bill. In the summer of 1906, Picasso and Fernand traveled back to Spain, where they stayed in a remote village in the Pyrenees Mountains. During his stay in the village, Picasso was remarkably prolific, producing 7 large paintings, a dozen medium-sized ones, and countless drawings, carvings, and watercolors. In his work at this time, Picasso seems to have been attempting to come closer to sculptural forms and colors, especially in this painting Adolescence. The work is reminiscent of classical sculptures, with both boys in poses often used in ancient Greek art. After 3 months, Picasso returned to Paris. There he became interested in a more primitive style. He made a radical break from his almost naturalistic treatment of the figure in works such as in this painting, Two Nudes, a decision that started him on his path toward Cubism. These new figures were bulky, and their volumes were clearly delineated. The earlier rose palette was replaced by brick and earth tones. Picasso claimed that the primitivism shown in these works was influenced by Iberian statues he had seen in an ethnographic museum in 1905. The brutality, and the lack of distinction, of these statues appealed to him as a way to replace traditional forms of beauty in his work. Toward the end of 1906, Picasso began work on a large composition, Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, the Young Ladies of Avignon. The Avignon in the title referred to Avignon Street, in Barcelona, a popular red-light district for sailors. The women in the painting were not conventional images of beauty, but 5 nude prostitutes. This painting was Picasso's first masterpiece. The figures in the picture are composed of flat, splintered planes and faces, inspired by Iberian sculpture and African masks. The compressed space the figures inhabit appears to project forward in jagged shards. There is no vanishing point in the painting. Nowhere for the eye to move, beyond the women and their pointed glances. Les Demoiselles d'Avignon was such a revolutionary concept at the time that the painting was rejected, even by avant-garde painters and critics. When Picasso showed the painting to acquaintances in his studio later that year, the nearly universal reaction was shock and revulsion. His friend Henri Matisse angrily dismissed the work as a hoax. Because of the negative reaction, Picasso chose to roll up the canvas and to keep it out of sight. It was bought in the early 1920s by a gallery owner, sight unseen. The painting was also reproduced in the publication, The Surrealist Revolution in 1925, but remained relatively unknown until 1937, when it was shown at the Petit Palais in Paris. The New York Museum of Modern Art bought it soon afterwards, and, in later years, it became a prized part of their collection. In Les Demoiselles, Picasso suddenly found he had a creative direction that allowed him greater freedom of expression. Les Demoiselles was unlike anything Picasso, or anyone else, had painted before, and profoundly influenced the direction of art in the 20th century. These ideas led directly to the Cubist period that followed. The concept of Cubism was seen as a revolutionary new way to represent reality. It was the result of an artistic cooperation between Picasso and his friend, fellow painter, Georges Braque, between 1907 to 1908. Braque was shocked when he first viewed Les Demoiselles, but he quickly became intrigued with the idea of Cubism, seeing the new style as a revolutionary change of direction. In 1908, Picasso replaced the African-influenced striations and mask-like heads of his earlier works with elements similar to those found in earlier paintings by Paul Cézanne. The shallow space and plainer brushwork are especially evident in Picasso's work of 1908. For the first time, still life, inspired by Cézanne, became an important subject in Picasso's own body of work. Picasso's early Cubist paintings, known as analytic cubism, include this work, Bread and Fruit Dish on a Table, painted in 1909. In Cubist paintings, objects are broken apart and reassembled in an abstracted form, highlighting their geometric shapes and showing them from multiple viewpoints. Both destructive and creative, Cubism shocked, appalled, and fascinated the art world. A picture was no longer a depiction of the world, but an object in itself. In 2016, this painting, Sitting Woman, painted in 1909, sold at Sotheby's in London for $64 million, exceeding the estimate by nearly $20 million, and the highest price ever paid at auction for a Cubist work at that time. Picasso's later Cubist works are referred to as synthetic cubism, which moves even further away from traditional styles. In these paintings he added an expanded color palette, new textures, simpler shapes, new materials, and simplified the use of viewpoint and plane. These works bridged the gap between reality and art by including pieces of the real world on the canvas. Real pieces of paper replaced painted paper, real sheet music replaced drawn musical notation, and so on. From the time of its invention until around 1920, synthetic cubism was considered the height of the avant-garde. It expanded the range of ways painters could explore reality, and contributed to the rise of the Dadaists, the Surrealists, and even pop art. Early Cubist paintings were often misunderstood by critics and viewers alike. They were thought to be merely geometric art. The painters themselves believed that they were presenting a new kind of reality, that broke away from Renaissance traditions. For example, they used multiple views of an object on the same canvas to convey more information than could be contained in a single limited, traditional view. The concept of Cubism changed the face of European painting and sculpture forever. Its influence was similarly felt in parallel fields such as architecture, music, and literature. In 1911, 7 years after they first met, Picasso's mistress, Olivier, who was having problems with the tempestuous Picasso, began an affair with a young Italian painter. She asked an artist friend, Eva Goul, to cover for her in order to deceive Picasso. It was a mistake. Instead, Picasso took the opportunity to begin a clandestine affair with Eva himself. Within 6 months, Picasso left Olivier and moved in with Eva. Olivier was left without support. She took various odd jobs and also gave drawing lessons. 20 years later, she wrote her memoirs on their life together. The memoir, Picasso and His Friends, was published in serial form in 1930. Picasso objected strongly and hired lawyers to prevent the publication. They agreed on a settlement, and the payment she received helped her to improve her lifestyle, but it was soon gone. Later, Picasso gave her a small pension. She died in 1966. Picasso and Eva were well suited to each other, and their time together was a relatively tranquil period in Picasso's life. Eva seems to have been one of the few of his mistresses to have escaped his notorious temper. Eva had some talent as a businesswoman, and helped market and sell Picasso's works. Picasso adored Eva. He began adding coded messages to her in his works. Written phrases like "I love Eva," and the nickname, "Ma Jolie" or "My Pretty One." The famous woman with a guitar, shown here, was the artist's first work in synthetic cubism, and contains these words. A number of his works during this time are either known, or thought to be, of Eva. The best known of which is Woman in a Chemise in an Armchair, painted in 1913. By 1912, Picasso and Braque were gluing paper, and other materials, onto their canvases. That synthetic phase, 1912 to 1914, saw the reintroduction of color, while the actual materials often had an industrial reference, such as sandpaper or printed wallpaper. These experiments not only created new ideas for pictures, they also created pictures that were entirely novel in form. With collage, the world is not just depicted, but actually becomes a physical part of the artwork. No longer a window on objects in the world, the picture was now an arrangement of signs that refer to those objects. In Picasso's works, the multiple references inherent in his synthetic compositions, such as curves that refer to guitars, and at the same time to ears, introduce an element of play that is characteristic of so much of his work. This leads to the suggestion that one thing is transformed into another. For example, in this painting, Picasso plays with the rounded forms of the violin and the woman's body. He makes use of real wood grain and painted paper to create an harmonious composition. In August 1914, at the outbreak of World War I, Picasso was living in Avignon with Eva. His artist friends Braque and Derain joined the French infantry, and Apollinaire the artillery. The war was the end of Cubism as a movement. Picasso returned to Paris with Eva in October. As Spain was a neutral country, Picasso was able to continue painting throughout the war, unlike his French comrades, who were drafted. During this period his paintings became more somber, and his life changed with dramatic consequences. In 1915, Eva, who had always been of delicate health, died of tuberculosis. Eva hid the nature of her illness from Picasso for as long as possible, but she was taken to hospital in the autumn of 1915. Picasso made a long trip each day to visit her. On her death, Picasso was devastated. In 1917, Picasso met the young poet and writer Jean Cocteau, who was a friend and collaborator of the ballet impresario Sergei Diaghilev. Cocteau was keen to involve Picasso in a project for Diaghilev's ballets Russes. Picasso had not worked on a ballet before. He agreed to travel to Rome for 2 months to collaborate on the ballet Parade. Picasso's large backcloth for Parade, measuring 17 by 11 meters, made it the largest of his works. An Italian artist worked with him to fill the canvas with paint. The backdrop is now displayed in the Centre Pompidou in Metz, France. Parade was first performed in May 1917, at a theatre in Paris, where it was considered by the establishment to be an attempt to undermine the solidarity of French culture. The composer was the principal target of abuse, partly because he included the noises of aeroplane propellers and typewriters in his score. Picasso disarmed the public with the contrast between his basically realistic stage curtain and the startling synthetic cubist constructions worn by the performers. Between 1919 and 1924, Picasso continued to collaborate with the ballets Russes, producing designs for 4 more ballets. While in Rome, Picasso met the ballerina Olga Hochlover, who also attended the opening performance of Parade. Olga Hochlover was the daughter of a colonel in the Imperial Russian Army. Diaghilev liked to include girls from a higher social class in his company, even if they were not very good at dancing. Olga was, above all, average, an average ballerina, of average beauty, and average intelligence. For Picasso, who had relationships with all manner of women, Olga was so conventional as to be positively exotic. And there was a touch of mystery about her too. Picasso had always found all things Russian to be fascinating, and he saw in her his entry into high society, and a pathway to the adulation of the upper classes that he craved. He married her in the summer of 1918, in Paris, in a Russian Orthodox church. Max Jacob and Guillaume Apollinaire were witnesses at the civil ceremony. The happy couple spent their honeymoon near Biarritz, in the villa of a glamorous Chilean art patron. This work was painted in 1917. As you can see, Picasso has returned to classic portrait techniques. At that time, he felt at peace with the world, although art critics condemned him for his excessive realism and betrayal of his style. Strangely, the same people had previously criticized him for his Cubist works. Hochlover introduced Picasso to high society, formal dinner parties, and other dimensions of the life of the rich in 1920s Paris. Hochlover's insistence on social propriety clashed with Picasso's bohemian tendencies, and the two lived in a state of constant conflict. In 1921, Picasso and Olga had a son Paolo. He was to be Picasso's only child with Olga. The son would grow up to be a motorcycle racer and a chauffeur to his father. Picasso's work between 1915 and 1920 seem unexpectedly naturalistic in contrast to the Cubist works that he had painted earlier. For example, this painting, El Passage de Colombe. During this period, there also appears to be a conscious imitation of the drawing styles of earlier artists, such as Ingres and Renoir. For example, in this portrait drawings of Max Jacob, painted in 1915. After his travels to Italy, and a return to Barcelona in 1917, a further new influence began to appear in his work. This was his neo-classical period. A brief return to classic realism, in a career otherwise dominated by experimentation. Like Picasso's other paintings at this time, they are not really classical, and in many ways, Picasso is thought to be mocking his critics through them. This picture, for example, may have the elements of Greco-Roman antiquity, but the details do not support this view. The characters in the painting are not modeled after classical figures that emanate stillness, calm and serenity. Instead, Picasso has manipulated their bodies and exaggerated their poses to make them appear wild, and to excite us with their frenzy and passion. The painting has a rustic quality, and the figures are clumsy and careless about their appearance and dress. It is thought that Picasso's intention was not solely to return to a classical way of painting, he was also mocking the return to the classics movement that was prevalent in the 1920s art world at that time. Picasso had intimate connections with the Surrealists, but he never became an official member of the group. He exhibited his Cubist work, Man with Guitar, at the first Surrealist group exhibition in 1925, but the theoretical concepts outlined in the Surrealist Manifesto never entirely appealed to him. What the Surrealist movement gave to Picasso were new subjects, especially erotic ones. They also reinforced disturbing elements, already found in Picasso's work. The many variations on the subject of bathers, with their overtly sexual and contorted forms in his Dinar series, clearly show the impact of Surrealism on his work. In 1927, while still living with Olga, 46-year-old Picasso met 17-year-old Marie-Thérèse Walter and began a long-standing relationship with her. After a time, Picasso moved Marie-Thérèse into an apartment across the street from his family home in Paris. The greatest sexual adventure of Picasso's life, with no boundaries and no taboos, had begun. It was fueled by the secretiveness that surrounded the relationship and the revelation that the childlike Marie-Thérèse was an endlessly submissive and willing sexual partner. She readily accepted all experimentation with absolute obedience to Picasso's will. She was an object that he alone possessed, proof of his power and sexual magnetism. Picasso managed to hide the existence of Walter from his wife, and even from his closest friends, for many years. They knew that he had a mistress who was also serving as an artistic muse, but they didn't know her name, or even what she looked like, beyond what they saw in sketches and portraits. In 1930, the now very rich Picasso purchased the Château Bois-Guillaume, northwest of Paris, where he had room for a sculpture studio. There, with his mistress Marie-Thérèse Walter as his muse, Picasso began working on large-scale plaster heads. He also made constructions incorporating found objects, and, until the end of his life, Picasso continued working on sculptures in a variety of materials. Picasso's inspiration for Head of a Woman was Marie-Thérèse Walter, whose features, he believed, lent themselves to representation in a classical mode. The privacy of his life with the undemanding Marie-Thérèse formed a contrast to the hectic pace of life kept by Olga and her bourgeois circle of society friends. Once in Bois-Guillaume, Picasso lived secretly with Marie-Thérèse, and she became the subject of his often lyrical, sometimes erotic paintings, in which he combined intense color with flowing forms. The mythical Minotaur, part man, part bull, was Picasso's alter ego in the 1930s, and replaced the Harlequin in his work. The Minotaur was also used by the Surrealists, who saw it as the personification of forbidden desires. The Minotaur, and Picasso's mistress Marie-Thérèse, are heavily featured in his celebrated etchings, the Volar suite created from 1930 to 1937. A painting called The Dream, painted in 1932, by 50-year-old Picasso, portrays his 24-year-old mistress Marie-Thérèse. The Dream has made headlines a few times. It was sold to a collector in 2006 for $139 million. Its then owner accidentally put his elbow through it. After an expensive restoration and insurance claim, it was sold again in 2013 for $155 million. The painting belongs to Picasso's period of distorted depictions, with its oversimplified outlines and contrasted colors, resembling early Fauvism. In 1935, Olga learned of Picasso's ongoing secret relationship with Marie-Thérèse from a friend, who also informed her that Walter was pregnant. Olga immediately left Picasso, and she and their son Paolo moved to the south of France, where she impounded Picasso's work in her possession until he agreed to pay her a large allowance. French law required an even division of property on divorce. Picasso did not want to lose half his wealth, so he refused to divorce Olga, and the two remained legally married and living apart until Hot Lover's death in 1955. This was a time of great anxiety in Picasso's life. Between 1935 and 1936, he virtually gave up painting and started writing instead. A collection of his poems were published in the French magazines Art Notebook in 1935 and in the Art Gazette in 1936. In all, between 1935 and 1959, Picasso wrote over 300 poems. They were largely untitled, except for a date and sometimes the location of where it was written. These works were a stream of consciousness play on words. The poems were usually erotic, and at times slightly mad. As were his two full-length plays, Desire Caught by the Tail 1941, and The Four Little Girls 1949. Described as surrealistic and simply weird, the plays are rarely produced, because nobody fully understands them. Many critics believe that Picasso never meant for these works to be staged, only read. On the 5th of September 1935, Picasso and Marie-Thérèse's daughter, Maria de la Concepción, called Maya, was born. The birth certificate identified the father as unknown. Marie-Thérèse and Maya stayed with Picasso in the south of France for 2 months, and then at a house near Versailles, which Picasso visited on the weekends, and some weekdays to play with his daughter. Maya also modeled for some of Picasso's paintings, including Maya with Doll 1938. And here's what she really looked like. During his tempestuous marriage to Olga, Marie-Thérèse's unassuming and yielding personality provided a haven to Picasso. However, her lack of intellectual inquiry and spirit became problematic once he was alone with her. In 1936, Picasso began another relationship, this time with Dora Maar, a successful French photographer working in the Surrealist movement. She became his latest close companion and model. Marie-Thérèse became jealous when she found out about Maar, but she continued to remain devoted to Picasso throughout her life. Dora Maar met Picasso in January 1936, when she was 28 years old and he 54. She spoke Spanish fluently, as she had spent her childhood in Argentina, so Picasso was even more fascinated. Their relationship lasted nearly 9 years. Her artistic independence and intellectual abilities were certainly part of the attraction. Throughout their affair, Picasso neither divorced his wife Olga, nor gave up his relationship with his mistress, Marie-Thérèse Walter. But he was separated from Olga, and visited Walter in private, so Maar provided him with a striking, clever, accomplished and willing companion. Picasso often painted beautiful sad Dora. He called her his private muse. For him, she was his weeping woman. This painting, Dora Maar with Cat, sold for $95.2 million at Sotheby's in 2006. The Spanish Civil War, 1936 to 1939, and the dictatorship of Francisco Franco, 1939 to 1975, meant that Picasso, who was openly pro-communist and had spoken out against Franco, had to move away from Spain and spend the rest of his life in France. In April 1937, Nazi bombers, supporting Franco's nationalist forces, carried out a devastating aerial attack on the Basque town of Guernica in northern Spain. This city, which had no strategic military value, became history's first aerial saturation bombing of a civilian population. 70% of the city was destroyed, and fires burned for 3 days. A third of the population were wounded or killed. Earlier, the Republican government of Spain had commissioned Picasso to paint a mural for the Spanish pavilion at the 1937 World Fair in Paris. Outraged by the bombing of the Spanish town and the inhumanity of war, Picasso used the opportunity to produce Guernica, a 3.5 by 7.8 meter anti-war painting, in black, white and grey. Picasso chose not to represent the horror of Guernica in realist or romantic terms. Key figures were refined, in sketch after sketch, then transferred to the huge canvas, which he also reworked several times. The painting, Guernica, was exhibited in July 1937 at the Spanish Pavilion at the Paris International Exposition. After the victory of Franco in Spain, the painting was sent to the United States to raise funds and support for Spanish refugees. Until 1981, the painting was entrusted to the Museum of Modern Art in New York City. Today, the painting permanently resides in Spain's National Museum of Modern Art in Madrid. The expressive quality of both form and gesture in the composition of Guernica influenced some of Picasso's later works. An example is the intensely colored Weeping Woman, 1937, as well as in related prints and drawings. Weeping Woman is an iconic image of unspeakable grief and pain, representing universal suffering. The fragmented features, and the use of acid green and purple, heighten the painting's emotional intensity. The model for Weeping Woman was Dora Maar. The painting is said to reflecting the couple's complex, and often stormy relationship. In 1939, the Museum of Modern Art, in New York City, held a major retrospective of Picasso's works. The exhibition lionized Picasso, bringing Americans up to date on the full scope of his artistry. The result was a greater understanding of his work by American art historians and scholars at the time. The newspaper critics, on the other hand, were surprisingly ambivalent. Picasso's multiplicity of styles was disturbing to one journalist, while another described him as wayward and even malicious. Art News, having a bet both ways, concluded that Picasso was both a charlatan and a genius. In 1940, while German forces occupied Paris, Picasso applied for French citizenship, but was refused on the grounds of his extreme ideas regarding communism. He retreated to a rented apartment in a small fishing village on the French Atlantic coast. In 1941, when it too was overrun by Hitler's troops, he found himself in a difficult position. He was unable to return to Spain, so he made the risky decision to live in Paris for the duration of the occupation, despite offers of asylum in America and Mexico. Although the Nazis considered Picasso's paintings to be degenerate, and Guernica a symbol of defiance against fascism, he remained free from persecution, because of his widespread fame. He was, however, prevented from exhibiting his work, resulting in his disappearance from the world stage. From 1939 to 1945, Picasso primarily painted portraits, nudes or still lifes. Skulls, often a symbol of the fragility of life, are a frequently recurring motif in his work during this time. Head of a woman, seen here, is a haunting skull, with clenched teeth, set against a background of menacing greys, and seems to represent the essence of death, and the defeat of France. In the spring of 1943, Pablo Picasso, 61, met and wooed 21-year-old artist, François Gillot. His mistress Dora Maar was devastated to learn that Picasso was replacing her with a much younger woman. She became so depressed that Picasso sent her to a psychiatrist, who treated her with psychoanalysis. In April 1944, Picasso left Maar, after giving her a drawing from 1915 as a goodbye gift. He also left to her some still lifes, and an 18th-century house located in one of the most beautiful regions of southern France. Maar, who was an award-winning photographer and painter, continued making art into her old age. In addition to becoming Picasso's model and muse, François Gillot was his intellectual equal. He wanted to talk and argue about his work with her, often until 2 or 3 in the morning. Her independence, her directness, and her penetrating insights fascinated and annoyed Picasso, and nourished his insatiable appetite for life. In 1946, Picasso moved to the Mediterranean with Gillot. The paintings of that time, and the ceramics he decorated at the studio in nearby Vallauris, beginning in 1947, vividly express Picasso's sense of identification with the classical tradition, and with his Mediterranean origins. Picasso, who was 65 years old, an age when most people retire, was once more in love with a very young woman, and full of creative fervor. François, 25, found she was pregnant shortly after this painting was finished. Picasso and Gillot never married, because of his existing marriage to Olga, but they did have 2 children together. Their son, Claude, was born in 1947, and their daughter, Paloma, in 1949. Many of the paintings Picasso produced during his 9 years with Gillot display the periods of happiness that the couple experienced during their time together. However, their relationship was difficult for Gillot, who had to endure Picasso's many infidelities. She finally left him in 1953. In the Shadow, painted in 1953, Picasso depicts himself in black silhouette, mourning Gillot's departure. When they split up, Picasso's longtime art dealer, who had also been showing Gillot's work, ended her contract with him. Picasso had said, "It's her, or me." But the agent helped Gillot find another gallery in Paris, and she continued to grow to become a very successful artist in her own right, after parting with Picasso. In 1964, 11 years after their separation, Gillot wrote a book, Life with Picasso, in which she describes his abusive treatment, and myriad infidelities that led her to leave him, taking the children with her. The book sold over 1 million copies in dozens of languages, despite an unsuccessful legal challenge from Picasso to stop its publication. From then on, a vengeful Picasso refused to see his children, Claude or Paloma, ever again. All the profits from the book were used to help Claude and Paloma mount a case to become Picasso's legal heirs. Shortly before Picasso's death, French inheritance laws changed, permitting illegitimate children to be recognized as heirs. In 1944, Picasso joined the French Communist Party, attended the World Congress of Intellectuals in Defense of Peace in Poland, and received the Stalin Peace Prize from the Soviet government, in 1950 and again in 1961. Picasso's dealer, a socialist, considered Picasso's communism sentimental, rather than political. He has never read a line of Karl Marx. Nor of Engels, he said. Picasso was against the intervention of the United Nations and the United States in the Korean War, and he depicted it in his painting Massacre in Korea. Picasso created this work at the beginning of 1951 to denounce the killings of civilians during the advance of the United States Army within North Korean territory. The art critics have said that the painting is based on unsubstantiated reports of American atrocities, and considers it one of Picasso's communist works. Pablo Picasso met Jacqueline Roch in 1953 at the Madura pottery on the French Riviera, where he made and painted ceramics. She was 26 years old, and he was 72. He romanced her by drawing a dove on her house in chalk, and bringing her 1 rose a day for 6 months, until she agreed to date him. They later married in Vallauris in 1961. The two were together for the remainder of Picasso's life. Roch not only became Picasso's steadfast companion, but also, as his muse, she became the principal image and source of inspiration for practically all of his later work. Picasso repeatedly turned toward the old masters for his themes in his later works. He became obsessed with the need to create variations on the earlier paintings, sometimes reworking a painting because he identified personally with it. An example is Delacroix's Women of Algiers, 1834, where the figure on the right in the original resembled Jacqueline Roque. More often, he seemed moved by the challenge to rework in his own way the complex pictorial and narrative problems the earlier artists had originally posed for themselves. In a sense, Picasso was writing himself into the history of art by associating himself with his predecessors. The Women of Algiers, shown here, which Picasso painted in 1955, set the record for the highest price ever paid for a painting at that time, when it sold at an auction at Christie's for $179 million in 2015. Picasso often did a complete series of variations on one particular work, the most famous being the series on Las Meninas, The Ladies in Waiting, of Velázquez, consisting of 58 separate pictures. And here is Picasso's version. In 1960, Picasso's lifelong friend and personal secretary, Jaime Sabarts, proposed, with Picasso's agreement, that the Barcelona City Council create a museum dedicated to Picasso's works. The Museum Picasso, in Barcelona, originally opened to the public in 1963 with the name, the Sabarts Collection. Picasso's opposition to the Franco regime made it impossible to name the museum after him at that time. In 1968, on the death of Sabarts, Picasso paid homage to his friend by adding to the Sabarts collection in Barcelona the blue portrait of Sabarts, and the series of Las Meninas. He also made a large donation of over 900 works, kept at the home of his family in Barcelona, to the museum's collection. In 1955, Picasso bought Villa La Californier, overlooking Cannes, where he lived with Jacqueline. In that same year, Olga Hochlover died. Over the years, Picasso had continued to financially support Marie-Thérèse Walter and their daughter Maya, even though he no longer visited them. Now that he was free of Olga, he telephoned Marie-Thérèse and asked her to marry him. She said no. She didn't want to share him with another woman. They never saw each other again. In 1961, Picasso and Jacqueline Roque were married in Vallauris, and moved to Villa Notre Dame de Vie in Mougins, which Picasso had recently purchased. The couple lived there for 12 years, until his death in 1973, at age 91. After Picasso's death, Jacqueline lived in the villa until her own death in 1986. Towards the end of his life, Picasso became almost a hermit. His friends blamed the possessive Jacqueline, who barred his children and grandchildren from the house. Picasso died on the 8th of April 1973 in Mougins, France, from heart failure. He was interred in the garden at the Château of Vauvenargues, a property he had acquired in 1958. After Picasso's death in 1973, the family fell to pieces. Pablito, Picasso's grandson, drank a bottle of bleach, and died a few months after Picasso's death, when Jacqueline would not allow him to see his grandfather's body. Paolo, Picasso's son by Olga, died of alcoholism, as a result of depression, in 1975. Marie-Thérèse Walter, Picasso's young lover, unable to get over his death, hanged herself in 1977. Even Jacqueline Roque, in poor health, depressed and lonely without Picasso, killed herself by gunshot in 1986, when she was 59 years old. She is buried beside Picasso in Vauvenargues. When Picasso died at age 91, he had become one of the most famous and successful artists in history. His career spanned a 78-year period, in which he created 13,500 paintings, 100,000 prints and engravings, and 34,000 illustrations. During Picasso's life, he had forbidden any discussion of death in his presence. He never made a will, because of his superstitions. Without a will, he might avoid death. A court-appointed auditor, who evaluated Picasso's assets after his death, said that he was worth between $530 million to $1.3 billion in today's money. In addition to his art, his heirs fought over the license to his image rights. The division of his estate took 6 years, with often bitter negotiations among his 7 heirs. The settlement cost $30 million, and produced what has been described as a saga worthy of the French novelist, Balzac. Today, Picasso is revered for his technical mastery and visionary creativity. Over his long life, he devoted himself to an artistic production that contributed significantly to the development of modern art in the 20th century. During his lifetime, Picasso was the world's most prolific and most photographed artist. He is the most reproduced, most widely exhibited, most faked, most stolen, and most pirated artist in the world. He will be long remembered.